The morning was heavy with silence. A pale gray stretched across the sky, swallowing the light and casting long muted shadows over the small town churchyard. The bells tolled slowly, their hollow echoes drifting through the air like whispers of grief. Every note felt like a farewell, not just to a man who had passed, but to the fragile thread of hope that tied a little girl's heart to her world. Emily stood at the edge of the freshly dug grave, her small hands wrapped tightly around a worn teddy bear. The bear's once bright fur had dulled with age, and one of its eyes hung loosely by a thread, but to Emily, it was more than a toy. It was her anchor, a reminder of the father who had carried it home from the market years ago, holding it out as if it were the most precious gift on earth. He had smiled that day, ruffling her hair, and promised her she would never be alone. Now he lay beneath the earth, his coffin lowered into the ground, the sound of shovels filling the air with the harsh scrape of metal against stone. Each clump of dirt that fell thudded like a drumbeat in Emily's chest. She flinched at the sound, as though the world itself was pounding against her fragile heart. Her father had been her light. He was the one who spun bedtime stories until her eyelids fluttered closed, the one who lifted her into his arms when tears streaked her cheeks, whispering that storms always passed and the sun always returned. He was the man who showed her what love meant. And now the very earth had swallowed him whole. Emily's eyes, red from hours of crying, searched the faces around her. Neighbors, family, friends, men and women who had known her father, all gathered in hushed clusters. Their words were soft, their sighs heavy, but none of them stepped close enough to bridge the void yawning inside her. Just behind her stood a woman draped in black. To the world, she looked like a grieving widow, her veil drawn low, her lips pressed into a thin line of sorrow. But behind that mask, Emily knew, lurked something colder. Resentment. This was her stepmother, a woman who had never wanted her, who looked at her not with pity but with eyes sharp and unyielding. For years she had tolerated Emily only because her father demanded it. Now, with him gone, that restraint had been buried with him. The service ended, the crowd began to drift away, and Emily felt the ground vanish beneath her feet. She wanted to call out, to beg someone to hold her hand, but her voice withered in her throat. She could only cling to the teddy bear, pressing her wet cheeks into its fur. As the last mourner walked through the gates, her stepmother's voice broke through the silence. It was not gentle, not soothing, but icy, each word like a blade. "You don't belong here anymore." Emily froze. The words struck deeper than any shovel against the earth. She turned, hoping she had misheard, but her stepmother's eyes were merciless, her tone final. The graveyard, once filled with whispers of grief, now seemed to echo with rejection. The little girl stumbled after her stepmother back to the house. Every corner of that home had once been filled with warmth. The kitchen where her father hummed while cooking, the worn armchair where he read aloud from his favorite books, the little garden where he pushed her on a swing. But as she stepped inside, Emily felt only emptiness. It was no longer home. Her stepmother wasted no time. Drawers yanked open. Clothes tossed into a battered suitcase. Shoes, socks, little ribbons her father had once tied in her hair, scattered carelessly as if they were rubbish. Emily's eyes filled with tears again, but this time she said something she had never said before. "Please, Mommy, forgive me." She wasn't guilty of anything, but in her small heart, she believed that maybe, just maybe, if she begged, if she sounded sorry, the woman might find a shred of kindness. Instead, a cold splash of water struck her face. A bucketful poured deliberately, drenching her hair, her dress, her tiny frame. She gasped, shivering as the icy droplets slid down her cheeks, mingling with her tears. The suitcase was shoved into the driveway. The door slammed behind her. Neighbors glanced from across the street. A man shook his head sadly, then turned away. No one stepped forward. The world watched her crumble, but no one dared interfere. Emily sank to her knees on the concrete, clutching the teddy bear against her chest as though it could shield her from the cruelty that had stolen everything she loved. The sun blazed above, but to her, the day felt colder than any winter storm. Her suitcase had spilled open, her clothes scattered on the ground. Birds sang in the trees as though mocking her, reminding her that life continued even when hers had shattered. She buried her face in the bear's fur, whispering her father's promise to herself, as if repeating it could make it real. "You'll never be alone." But in that moment she had never felt lonelier. And then the sound of wheels crunching against gravel. Emily lifted her head. A black car had pulled up at the edge of the driveway. The door opened slowly and a tall man stepped out. His suit was sharp, his presence commanding. To anyone else he was just a figure of wealth and power, someone whose reputation traveled faster than his footsteps. But his eyes, softened by a memory that stirred in his chest, betrayed something rare. Empathy. His name was Alexander. And for Emily, his arrival was about to change everything. Alexander's footsteps echoed across the driveway, steady and deliberate. He didn't rush, but each step carried weight, as though the earth itself recognized the authority of his presence. Emily's wide, tear-streaked eyes lifted to him, filled with both fear and fragile hope. For a fleeting instant she wished, it was her father returning to scoop her into his arms. But no, this man was different. His face was unfamiliar, yet his gaze was the kind that could melt the frost of even the cruelest winter. He stopped in front of her, lowering himself to one knee despite the puddle that would soak his immaculate trousers. Without hesitation, he placed a hand gently on her trembling shoulder. His voice, when it came, was firm but carried a tenderness that pierced through her despair. "This ends here," he said, his tone unshakable. "No one will ever treat you like this again." The words didn't sound like a casual promise. They rang like a decree, something carved into stone, something that couldn't be broken. The front door flew open, banging against the wall. Emily's stepmother stormed out, her face flushed with rage, her eyes blazing at the sight of Alexander kneeling beside the child she had just cast out. Her voice, shrill and venomous, cut through the air. "She doesn't belong here. She never did. She is nothing but a burden." Emily flinched, hugging her teddy bear tighter. But Alexander rose slowly, turning to face the woman. He was taller, stronger, and though his posture was calm, his presence was enough to make the crowd that had gathered across the street lean forward in silence. "Burden?" he repeated, his voice low, steady. "You call a grieving child a burden? After her father has just been laid into the ground?" His eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her step back slightly, though pride forced her chin up. "You don't understand," the stepmother spat. "I never wanted her. She's not mine. And now that he's gone, she's nothing to me." The word struck Emily like a lash, but before the pain could take root, Alexander spoke again. "If you can abandon her after burying her father, then you don't deserve the word mother at all." Gasps rippled through the bystanders. Neighbors who had remained silent until now began to whisper, their voices swelling like a wave. "Did you hear what he said? He's right. She should be ashamed." The stepmother's cheeks flushed, but she stood her ground, crossing her arms. "And what do you plan to do, stranger? Take her with you? You think money can solve everything?" Alexander took a step closer. "Money has nothing to do with this," he said. "This is about humanity, compassion. Something you clearly know nothing about. Yes, I will take her. From this moment on, she is no longer unwanted." The word struck with such authority that the crowd fell into silence again. For the first time, the stepmother hesitated. She could not compete, not with his wealth, not with the steel in his voice, not with the truth of what he had said. She sneered, muttered something under her breath, and with a final huff, turned on her heel and slammed the door shut. This time, the slam didn't mean rejection for Emily. It meant freedom. Emily sat frozen, clutching her bear. She didn't know whether to cry, to run, or to simply collapse into the arms of the stranger who had just defended her like no one else had since her father's passing. Alexander knelt again, lifting her small suitcase from the ground. He carefully gathered her scattered clothes and, with surprising gentleness for a man of his stature, brushed dirt off her teddy bear before placing it back into her hands. Then he extended his palm. "Come with me," he said softly. "You don't have to stay here anymore." Her hand, so small and fragile, hovered in the air for a moment. Trust had been shattered so deeply in the span of days that she wasn't sure whether to reach out. But something in his eyes, something that reflected her father's warmth, made her take a leap of faith. Her fingers slipped into his, and for the first time since the funeral, she felt a flicker of safety. The black car door swung open and Alexander helped her inside. As the engine roared to life, Emily glanced back at the house one last time. The place that had once been filled with laughter now looked like a prison of cruelty. She tightened her grip on her teddy bear and whispered a silent goodbye. The drive away from that street felt surreal. Emily pressed her forehead against the window, watching familiar places blur past. Every corner reminded her of her father, every street a memory of simpler days. She wanted to cry again, but exhaustion weighed too heavily on her. Alexander sat quietly beside her. He didn't bombard her with questions. He didn't tell her everything would be all right in shallow platitudes. He simply sat there, present, offering her the silent comfort of someone who understood pain. For in that moment, as he looked at Emily's small figure curled against the door, a memory returned to him. He saw himself as a boy, alone, lost, grieving after his mother's death. He remembered how relatives turned away, how the people who should have cared shut their doors. He remembered the sting of rejection, the long nights of loneliness. And he vowed, silently, fiercely, that this little girl would never have to feel that same emptiness again. The car slowed as they approached the gates of Alexander's estate. The mansion loomed ahead, grand and imposing, with gardens that stretched for acres. Emily's eyes widened, but she didn't speak. She didn't care about wealth, about marble floors or gilded doors. All she wanted was a place where her heart wouldn't hurt anymore. The gates opened and the car rolled into the driveway. For Emily, this was the first step into a new chapter of her life, though she couldn't yet know how much this man's kindness would transform her world. The gates closed behind them, and though the noise of the street faded, Emily still felt the silence pressing inside her chest. Alexander guided her carefully through the halls of the mansion, his stride slow and measured, as if he knew that rushing her would only make the fear worse. Her little shoes tapped against the polished marble floor, echoing faintly in the vastness of the estate. To anyone else the place might have been dazzling, but to Emily it was overwhelming. She clutched her teddy bear tighter than ever, her wide eyes flicking nervously around the unfamiliar walls and chandeliers. He stopped at a room near the end of the hallway and pushed the door open. The space inside was calm, with soft cream-colored bedding, a window that looked out over the gardens, and shelves waiting to be filled with her things. It wasn't grand compared to the rest of the house, but it had been prepared with care. Alexander put her small suitcase down gently and stepped back, letting her take it in at her own pace. Emily hesitated at the threshold, almost afraid to enter, as though stepping inside might mean she was betraying the memory of her father. When she finally crossed the room and stood by the window, she saw a stretch of flowers in full bloom, rows of color arranged with precision. For a fleeting moment her heart eased, but then the ache returned. This was not her father's garden, not the home where he used to push her on the swing or read her bedtime stories. Her throat tightened, her small shoulders began to shake, and tears rolled down her cheeks again. Alexander didn't approach her with platitudes. He simply sat in the chair by her desk, his deep voice calm and steady. He told her he understood that her world had been torn apart, that no one could replace her father, and that nothing would erase the loss she carried. But he also told her something else, something that made her turn toward him through her tears. He promised she would never again be unwanted. He promised that here in this house with him she would be safe. The words didn't erase her grief, but they planted the first fragile seed of trust. The nights that followed were difficult. Emily woke from nightmares, her cries carrying down the long corridors. She dreamed of coffins closing, of cruel voices casting her out, of the cold bucket of water drenching her in humiliation. At first she curled into herself, afraid to let anyone near. But Alexander came each night and sat quietly by her bed. He didn't overwhelm her with questions or insist she stop crying. Instead, he opened a book and read aloud in a low voice until her eyelids grew heavy again. Sometimes he chose fairy tales, sometimes stories she recognized from her father. He stayed until her breathing calmed, watching over her in silence. In the daylight hours he made sure her needs were met. Tutors came to teach her, meals were prepared with thought for what a child might like, and her clothes were fitted with care. But above all else he gave her his presence. He walked with her in the gardens, showing her flowers and telling her about their names. He sat by the pond and taught her how to skip stones, chuckling when hers sank immediately. He never forced laughter from her, never demanded gratitude. He simply let her exist in safety until she was ready to reach back. It happened slowly, in moments too small to notice at first. She began answering him with more than a nod. She walked closer to him rather than hanging back. She let him take her hand without pulling away. And then one afternoon, when he bent down in the garden to show her how to blow the white seeds of a dandelion into the wind, the fluffy cloud stuck to his hair in a most ridiculous way. Emily's eyes widened, and before she could stop herself, a giggle escaped. It was soft and fragile, but it was real. Alexander froze, then broke into a smile that reached his eyes. He told her that was the sound the world had been missing, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Emily let herself smile too. It wasn't full or fearless, but it was a start. Word spread quickly through the town. People who had once averted their gaze at the cruelty of her stepmother now whispered about the wealthy man who had taken in the abandoned girl. Some were skeptical, assuming it was a show of charity or a whim of wealth, but others noticed the way he treated her. They saw her walking beside him in the market, her small hand held safely in his. They saw the patience in his posture when she spoke. They saw how her eyes, once dim with sorrow, began to carry faint glimmers of light again. Those whispers reached her stepmother too, though she pretended not to care. But the truth was undeniable. The child she had thrown away had found something she herself never possessed: real love, freely given. Emily, for her part, no longer wasted thoughts on the house she left behind. The pain was still there, but it was being reshaped into something gentler by the steady kindness of the man who had promised her she would never be alone again. The months slipped by, carrying Emily further from the day that had once shattered her world. At first the wounds of her grief clung tightly, refusing to let her sleep without nightmares or face the day without fear. But slowly, through patient hours and quiet reassurances, Alexander gave her what she needed most: time. He never rushed her healing. He never demanded that she forget her pain. Instead, he stayed steady, as constant as the sunrise, so that little by little she began to believe that promises could still be kept. The mansion became less of a cavern and more of a home. Emily's laughter, faint and uncertain at first, grew stronger with each passing week. She began to decorate her shelves with books, small trinkets, and drawings she made in colored pencils Alexander had bought for her. Each page she filled seemed like a small act of reclaiming her childhood. She still kept the teddy bear close, but now it sat on her pillow instead of being clutched to her chest every waking moment. It had gone from a shield of survival to a companion of comfort. Alexander, too, found himself changed. The businessman who once lived by schedules, meetings, and deals discovered that his most important appointments were the evenings spent reading bedtime stories, or the afternoons chasing Emily through the garden as she laughed breathlessly. The weight of his wealth and reputation had always been heavy, but in caring for Emily he found something lighter, purer, that reminded him why life was worth more than the figures in his accounts. The townspeople began to notice more than just the transformation of the girl. They noticed him too. Where once Alexander had been spoken of as a distant figure of money and influence, now he was seen as a man whose wealth did not shield him from compassion. Neighbors who had kept their distance began to greet him differently, not with fear or envy, but with respect born of admiration. Even those who had once turned away when Emily was cast out now carried a quiet guilt, softened only by seeing how she was thriving. Emily still had her difficult days. Sometimes the memories of her father's absence struck suddenly, and she would crumble into tears. When that happened, Alexander never told her to be strong or to stop crying. He sat beside her, letting her grief flow, and then gently reminded her that she was safe now, that love had not died with her father, it had only taken on a new form. Those words began to settle into her heart until she could breathe more easily again. One bright afternoon, Emily asked Alexander if she could visit her father's grave. It had been months since the funeral, and though the pain was still sharp, she felt strong enough now to face it. Alexander agreed without hesitation, arranging a quiet trip with no fanfare, no crowd, just the two of them. The cemetery was still and peaceful when they arrived, the air crisp with the scent of cut grass and earth. Emily carried a small bouquet of wildflowers she had picked from the garden, their colors vibrant against her small hands. She walked slowly between the rows of stones until she reached the one that bore her father's name. For a moment she froze, the ache swelling in her chest as if no time at all had passed since she had last stood there. She knelt down, placing the flowers gently against the headstone. Her fingers brushed over the engraved letters, and her lips trembled. "I miss you, Daddy," she whispered. "But you don't have to worry anymore. I'm safe now." Her voice broke, but she pressed on. "He takes care of me. He tells me stories like you did. He makes sure I laugh. You said I'd never be alone, and I'm not. You kept your promise in a way I didn't understand before." Alexander stood a few steps behind her, giving her the space she needed, but his eyes shone with quiet emotion. He saw in her words not just grief but strength, the kind of resilience born only from surviving deep pain. For a man who had once been broken by his own childhood losses, watching Emily find her footing again felt like redemption. As Emily stood, the sunlight broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow across the cemetery. She turned back toward Alexander, her eyes glistening but steady. He reached out his hand and she placed her smaller one into his without hesitation. Together they walked back toward the gates, leaving behind the weight of sorrow but carrying forward the love that would never fade. From that day on, Emily's steps grew lighter. She returned to her studies with more confidence, her laughter now a regular sound in the halls of the mansion. She told Alexander stories of her father with joy rather than only tears, learning that remembering could be a way of keeping him close instead of only reopening the wound. And Alexander, though he had once thought of himself as a man defined by his business and his fortune, discovered that his greatest wealth was not in contracts or estates. It was in the small voice that called his name when she wanted him near. It was in the laughter that filled the garden at dusk. It was in knowing that one act of compassion had not only saved a child but had given him back a piece of his own lost soul. The townspeople's whispers turned into admiration, then into inspiration. They spoke of Emily not as the abandoned girl, but as the one who had found hope where none should have been. They spoke of Alexander not as the aloof millionaire, but as the man who showed that love was stronger than cruelty, and that kindness, once chosen, could ripple outward into the lives of many. In the quiet moments at the end of each day, Emily sometimes still clutched her teddy bear as she drifted to sleep. But now, instead of clutching it in fear, she held it in comfort, her breathing calm, her dreams lighter. She had lost her father, but she had not lost love. She had gained a protector, a guide, and a home in the heart of someone who truly cared. And so, her story became a living reminder that family is not always the one we are born into. Sometimes, it is the one we find when compassion reaches out a hand at the moment we need it most.